Jesus is trying to lead us to life. It's why he says, beware. I'm trying to rid you from the grip of greed. I'm trying to point you and have you head your life in a new direction toward true riches. What are true riches according to Jesus? Being rich toward God. And he goes on to describe what that looks like. Look at verse 31. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you as well. Don't be afraid, little flock, for your Father has been pleased to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions. Give to the poor. Provide purses for yourself that do not wear out. A treasure in heaven that will not fail, where no thief comes near and no moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Friends, possessions are not eternal. People are eternal. People are eternal. Their destiny is eternal. And that's where we should be investing in. Loving people and sharing the gospel, financially investing in the eternity of people, which is exactly what Jesus came to do. I mean, that's the gospel. God who was rich, who became poor, became one of us, laid his life, gave everything for us so that we could enter into the kingdom forever through his substitutionary death on the cross for our sins. So we could be rich forever, have eternity with him. That's what he's after. Friends, are we investing in what is eternal? Are we investing in what is temporal? How do you define wealth? How do you define wealth? Do you define it by what you have or what you give? I mean, really, how do you define wealth? What are you counting most? Dollars saved, dollars in your account, your total assets, the purchase price of your home, or what your value is of your home, your cars? Are you counting what you can give? Most people have heard of the name of the preacher George Whitefield. You remember George Whitefield? You know his name? He was instrumental in the Great Awakening of the 18th century. He might be the greatest evangelist in history outside of the Apostle Paul. Incredible what he was able to do. But a name that you might not be as familiar with is Lady Huntington. Now, Lady Huntington was a wealthy member of England's aristocracy, but she was also a very devout woman of faith. She heard George Whitefield one day preach, and she was just astounded at the gift that God had given this man to preach. And so she wrote him a letter, and in the letter she said this: God chose me to be a member of England's nobility, and now I'm ready to use my position for Jesus' sake. She goes on and says, Galatians 2:20 said that Paul preached privately to those who seemed influential in Jerusalem. And she said, I have a burden for the influential in England. They won't go out to the fields to hear preachers. At this time, the only place that would allow George Whitefield to go were the coal mines and the prairies and the fields. And the poor people were coming out to hear him. But the nobility was really shut out to the gospel at this point. So she says, they will come to my home to hear you preach. Isn't that awesome? And so what happened? She held these massive parties in her home. She went all out for hospitality at an enormous cost to herself and her own fortune. And she invited all the prominent people, politicians, actors, lords, ladies, even a few members of the royal family. And in her home, George Whitefield, somewhere in the middle of, they cling the crystal goblets, and they say, hey, everyone, if I can get your attention for the next 30 minutes, would you just want to draw your attention to the young man over here in the powdered wig named George Whitefield? He has a few things to share. And boy, did George share. He preached. Listen to what he said. Part of George Whitefield's sermon that day: my only aim is to bring you to Christ, to deliver you from your false confidences. Oh, man. Okay, let's get going, George. What else did he say? He says, to raise you from your dead formality and to revive real Christianity. Even to you that are rich, do I now freely offer salvation by Jesus Christ if you will renounce yourselves and come to Jesus as poor sinners. He did not mince words. He shared the gospel message of Jesus. And because of Lady Huntington's influence in the lives of these people. The scales began to fall from their eyes. Many of the wealthy, even the nobility, began to turn their lives back to the Lord. There was revival, not just among the poor, but also among the rich and the influential. 30 years later, fast forward 30 years, Lady Huntington returned to her hometown, Bath, a place that was much like North Wilmington, kind of upwardly mobile area, many self-dependent people, few Christians, few gospel-preaching churches, and there in her hometown, she decided to build a church. And many people scoffed at her. They said, why are you wasting your money building a church? But here's what she said. She said, I gave myself up to the Lord, and I likewise devoted all my fortune to him. Many benevolent persons who have no religion might care for the poor, as indeed we should. But few, even among professing Christians, have a proper concern for the awful condition of perishing souls. And within a few years, Lady Huntington was responsible for building 116 churches throughout England's cities and towns, and a seminary where she trained more and more preachers. And because of her laying the infrastructure and doing the behind-the-scenes renovations and setting up of these places for the gospel to be heard, the Great Awakening took off in England, spilled out over into America, and changed the face of the world in which we live today. Incredible what this one woman did. Lady Huntington was certainly rich, but listen, not because of what she had, but because of what she gave, it made her rich. Does that inspire you here today? You say, well, I don't have that kind of wealth. I can't have that kind of influence. Listen, all of us, whether we have a little or a lot, we all have resources. We all have time to leverage. We have gifts to leverage. We have relationships and relational circles of influence to leverage. We have talents, we have treasures, and we can give just like she did. Are you measuring what you can give? It's not about equal outcomes, it's about equal sacrifice. And that's true of our money as well. We can take our few loaves of fishes and put them into the hands of the miracle maker who can multiply them everywhere. How are you defining wealth? Now, here's the thing. Sooner or later, just as the man in the parable found out, life ends, and sometimes ends abruptly. And then it says in verse 20, who will get what we have prepared for ourselves? Who will get it? It's a great question, isn't it? One of my all-time favorite movies growing up in the 80s and the 90s was the movie The Goonies. Anybody in here like The Goonies? Okay. Most of you haven't seen it. Okay, well, here's the deal. I was a kid in the 80s. What am I going to do? It is a story about a group of kids who find a treasure map of the pirate One-Eyed Willie. And they decide to go on this epic, dangerous adventure to find this treasure. And all along the way in this journey, there's booby traps and danger. They're being chased by the Fratelli crime family. I mean, what a great plot, by the way, for a movie. Finally, nearly escaping all kinds of danger and death several times, they end up in this hidden cove where there's this enormous pirate ship. And they board the pirate ship, and they're looking for the gold. They can't find it. Suddenly, they find this hidden hull. And in the hull of this pirate ship, there around this table are these pirate skeletons. And all throughout this room and all over the table are treasures like you can't imagine. Gold coins, rubies, jewelry, all kinds of valuables. And there at the head of the table is a skeleton of One-Eyed Willie, and still gripping in his hands is his treasure. It's a powerful, iconic 80s movie scene, but it's also a haunting image of what Jesus is saying about greed, isn't it? See, the skeleton remains remind us that life is clearly not about the abundance of our possessions, is it? Because their fortune still is there in the pirate ship, but they're long gone. they couldn't take it with them. And instead, a bunch of Goonies now have it. Now, friends, some of us, when we pass, a bunch of Goonies are going to get our money. The government, some family members, other people. We have no idea what they're going to do with what we have. It's one of the reasons that Andy Stanley likes to say, do your giving while you're living, so you're knowing where it's going, which I think is a brilliant idea. See, listen, what Jesus is telling us is that the only true antidote for greed is generosity. I love what Randy Alcorn says in Treasure Principle. Generosity breaks us out of our orbit around our possessions, and we escape their gravity, entering a new orbit around our treasures in heaven. Friends, we have two bank accounts in this life. We have two bank accounts. We have a temporal bank account, and we have an eternal bank account. And throughout our lives, we are either making deposits into our temporal, earthly bank account, or we're making them into our eternal bank account. Every act of obedience with our money to God is a deposit into our eternal bank account. Every act of service to help other people, every sacrifice, a deposit into our eternal bank account. Every work of giving to the work of the Lord, every advancement to his kingdom is a deposit into the eternal bank account. An eternal bank account, not just for our own riches in eternity. Yes, Jesus motivates us by that, but for the eternity of souls that will come into the kingdom because of our investment. Friends, this is what Jesus wants for us. He wants us to be rich, but rich for eternity. What are you chasing? What has your heart?